Chapter 15. The Wonders of the Last Sea. Very soon after they had left Ramadu's country, they began to feel like they had already sailed beyond the world. All was different. For one thing, they all found they were needing less sleep. One did not want to go to bed, nor to eat much, nor even to talk except in low voices. Another thing was the light. There was too much of it. The sun, when it came up each morning, looked twice, if not 3 times, its usual size. And every morning, which gave Lucy the strangest feeling at all, the huge white birds singing their song with human voices in a language no one knew, streamed overhead and vanished astern on their way to the breakfast at Aslan's table. A little later, they came flying back and vanished into the east. I'm wondering, do we have anything like Aslan's table? What table do you think they have at church that might be that? How beautifully clear the water is, said Lucy to herself as she leaned over the port side early in the afternoon on the second day. And it was. The first thing she noticed was a little black object about the size of a shoe traveling at the same speed as the ship. For a moment, she thought it was something floating on the surface, but then there came floating past it a bit of stale bread, which the cook had just thrown out over the galley. And with a bit of bread, it looked as if it were going to collide with the black thing, but it didn't. It just passed above it. And Lucy now saw the black thing could not be on the surface. Then the black thing suddenly got very much bigger and flickered back to normal size a moment later. Now, Lucy knew she had seen something just like that happen somewhere else, if only she could remember where. She held her hand to her head and screwed up her face and put out her tongue in an effort to remember. But you saw the black shadow of your own coach running along at the same pace as the train. Then you went into the cutting, and immediately the shadow flickered close to you, and you got a big raking along the grass and the cutting bank. Then you came out, and the cutting and flick, once more, the black shadow had gone back to its normal size and was running along the fields. It's our shadow. It's the shadow of the Dawn Treader, said Lucy. Our shadow running along the bottom of the sea. That time, when it got bigger, it went over a hill. But in that case, the water must be clearer than I thought. Good gracious, I must be seeing the bottom of the sea, fathoms and fathoms down. As soon as she had said this, she realized the great silvery expanse, which she had been seeing without noticing for some time, was really the sand of the seabed, and that all sorts of darker and brighter patches were not lights and shadows on the surface, but real things on the bottom. At present, for instance, they were passing over a mass of soft, purpley green with broad winding stripe of pale gray in the middle of it. But now that she knew it was on the bottom, she saw it much better. She could see the bits of dark stuff were much higher than the others and were waving gently. Just like trees in the wind, said Lucy. I do believe that's what they are. It's a submarine forest. They passed on above it, and presently a pale streak was joined by another pale streak. If I was down there, thought Lucy, that streak would be just like a road through the wood, and that place where it joins the other wood would be crossroads. Oh, I do wish I was. Hello, a forest is coming to an end. And I do believe the streak really was a road. I can see it going on and on across the open sand. It's a different color, and it's marked out with something at the edges, dotted lines. Perhaps they're stones, and now it's getting wider. But it was not really getting wider. It was getting nearer. She realized this because of the way which the shadows in the ship came rushing up toward her, and the road, she felt sure it was a road now, began to go in zigzags. Obviously, it was climbing up a steep hill. And when she held her head sideways and looked back, what she saw was very like what you see when you look down at a winding road from the top of a hill. She could even see the shafts of sunlight falling through the deep water onto the wooded valley, and the extreme distance making everything melting away into dim greenness. But some places, the shiny ones, she thought, were ultramarine blue. She could not, however, spend much time looking back. What was coming into view in the forward direction was too exciting. The road had apparently now reached the top of the hill and ran straight forward, little specks of moving to and fro on it. And now something most wonderful, fortunately in full sunlight, or as full as can be when it falls through fathoms of water, flashed into sight. It was knobbly and jagged and of a pearly or perhaps an ivory color. She was so nearly straight above it that at first she could hardly make out what it was, but everything became plain when she noticed its shadow. The sun was falling across Lucy's shoulders, and the shadow of that thing lay stretched out on the sand behind it at the same angle. And by its shape, she saw clearly that it was the shadow of towers and pinnacles, myriads and minarets and domes. Why, it's a city or a huge castle, said Lucy to herself, but I wonder why they built it on top of a high mountain. Long afterward, when she was back in England and talked of these adventures over with Edmund, they thought of a reason, and I'm pretty sure it's the true one. In the sea, the deeper you go, the darker and colder it gets, and it is down there in the dark and cold that dangerous things live. The squid and the sea serpent and the karakin, the valleys of the wild, unfriendly places. So the sea people feel about the valleys as we do about mountains. They feel about mountains as we do about valleys. It is on the heights, or as we would say in the shallows, that there is warmth and peace. The reckless hunters and brave knights of the sea go down to the depths on quests and adventures, but return home to the heights for the rest and peace, courtesy and counsel, their spears, their sports, their dances, and their songs. They had passed the city, and the seabed was still rising. It was only a few hundred feet below the ship now. The road had disappeared, and they were sailing above an open park-like country, dotted with little groves of brightly covered vegetation. And then Lucy nearly squealed aloud with excitement. She had seen people. There were between 15 and 20 of them, and all mounted on seahorses, not the tiny little seahorses which you may have seen in museums, but horses rather bigger than themselves. And they must have been noble and lordly people, Lucy thought, for she could catch the gleam of gold on some of their foreheads, and streamers of emeralds or orange-colored stuff fluttered from their shoulders in the current. Then, oh, bother these fish, said Lucy, for a whole shoal of small fish swimming quite close to the surface had come between her and the sea people. But though her spoiled view had led to the most interesting thing of all, suddenly a fierce little fish of the kind she had never seen before came darting up from below, snapped, grabbed, and sank, capturing one of the fat fish in its mouth. And all of the sea people were stirring on their horses, staring up at what had happened. There seemed to be talking and laughing, and before the hunting fish had got back to them with its prey, another of the same kind, came up from the sea people, and Lucy was almost certain that this one, big seaman, who sat on his seahorse in the middle of the paddy, had sent it or released it as if it had been holding it back, and then in his hand or on his wrist. I do declare, said Lucy, it's a hunting party, or more like a hawking party. Yes, that's it. They ride out with these little fierce fish on their wrists, just as we used to ride out with falcons on our wrists when we were kings and queens at Cair Paravel long ago. And then they fly them, or I suppose should say swim them, at the others. How she stopped suddenly because the scene was changing. The sea people had noticed the dawn treader. The shoal of fish had scattered in every direction. The people themselves were coming up with no food, coming up to find out the meaning of this big black thing which had come between them and their son. And now they were so close to the surface that if there had been in air instead of water, Lucy could have spoken to them. There were men and women both. All wore coronets of some kind, and many had chains of pearls. There were no other clothes. Their bodies were the color of old ivory, their hair dark purple. The king is in the center. No one could mistake him for anything but the king, looked proudly and fiercely into Lucy's face, and shook a spear in his hand. His knights did the same. The faces of the ladies were filled with astonishment. Lucy felt sure they'd never seen a ship or a human before. How could they, in the seas beyond the world's end, where no ship ever came? What are you staring at, Lou? Said a voice close to her. Lucy had been so absorbed by what she was seeing that she started at the sound, and when she turned, she found her arm had gone dead from leaning so long on the rail in one position. Dorian and Edmund were beside her. Look, she said. They both looked, but almost at once Dorian said in a low voice, turn round at once, your majesties. That's right, with our backs to the sea, and don't look as if you were talking about anything important. Why? What's the matter? Said Lucy, as she obeyed. It'll never do for the sailors to see all that, said Dorian. We'll have men falling in love with sea women and falling in love with the undersea country itself and jumping overboard. I've heard of that kind of thing happening before in strange seas. It's always unlucky to see these people. But we used to know them, said Lucy, in the old days at Cair Paravel, when my brother Peter was High King, they came to the surface and sang at our coronation. I think that must have been a different kind, Lou, said Edmund. They could live in the air as well, but under the water, I think these can't. By the look of them, they'd have surfaced and started attacking us long ago if they could. They seem very fierce. At any rate, began Drinian, but that moment, two sounds were heard. One was a plop. The other was a voice from the fighting top shouting, "Man overboard!" Then everyone was busy. Some of the sailors hurried aloft to take in a sail. Others hurried below to get to an oar, and Rents, who was on duty on the poop, began to put the helm hand over so as to come around and back to the man who had gone overboard. But by now, everyone knew that it wasn't strictly a man. It was Reepicheep. Drat that mouse, said Drurian. It's more trouble than all the rest of the ship's company put together. If there's any scrape to get into, he will get it, and it ought to be put in irons, keel hauled, marooned, have its whiskers cut off. Can anyone see the little blighter? All of this didn't mean that Drurian really disliked Reepicheep. On the contrary, he liked him very much and was therefore frightened about him, and being very frightened put him in a bad temper, just as your mother is much angrier with you for running out into the road in front of a car than a stranger would be. No one, of course, was afraid of Reepicheep drowning, for he was an excellent swimmer. But the three who knew what was going on below the water were afraid at those long, cruel spears in the hands of the sea people. In a few minutes, the Dawn Treader had come round, and everyone could see the black blob as the water, which was in the water, which was Reepicheep. He was chattering with the greatest of excitement, but his mouth kept getting filled with water. Nobody could understand what he was saying. He'll blurt the whole thing out if we don't shut him up, said Durian. To prevent this, he rushed to the side and lowered a rope himself, shouting at the sailors, all right, back to your places. I hope you can heave up a mouse without help. And Reepicheep began climbing the rope and was very nimbly because his wet fur had made him heavy. Durian leaned over and whispered to him, don't tell, not a word. But when the dripping mouse had reached the deck, it turned out not to be at all interested in the sea people. Sweet, Cheep, sweet. What are you talking about? Asked Durian crossly, and you needn't shake yourself all over me either. Well, I tell you, the water's sweet, said the mouse. Sweet, fresh. It isn't salt. For a moment, no one quite took in the importance of this, but then Reep once more repeated the old prophecy. Where do waves grow sweet? Doubt not, Reepicheep. There is the utter east. Then at last everyone understood. Let me have a bucket, my Ryef, said Durian. It was handed to him and lowered it, and up it came again. The water shone in it like glass. Perhaps your majesty would like to taste it first, said Durian to Caspian. The king took the bucket in both hands, raised it to his lips, sipped, and then drank deeply and raised his head. His face was changed. Not only his eyes, but everything about him seemed brighter. Yes, he said, it is sweet. There's real water that. I'm not sure that it ain't going to kill me, but it is the death I would have chosen if I'd known about it till now. What do you mean? Asked Edmund. It's like light more than anything else, said Caspian. That is what it is, said Reepicheep. Drinkable light. We must be very near the end of the world now. There was a moment's silence, and then Lucy knelt down on the deck and drank from the bucket. It's the loveliest thing I have ever tasted, she said with a kind of gasp, but oh, it's strong. We shouldn't need to eat anything now. And one by one, everyone on board drank, and for a long time, they were all silent. They felt almost too well and strong to bear it, and presently they began to notice another result. All of them said before there had been too much light ever since they left the island of Ramadou. The sun was too large, although not too hot, and the sea was too bright, and the air too shining. Now the light grew no less. If anything, it increased, but they could bear it. They could look straight up into the sun without blinking. They could see more light than they had ever seen before, and the deck and the sail and their own faces and bodies became brighter and brighter, and every rope shone. The next morning, when the sun rose, now 5 or 6 times its old size, they turned hard into it and could see the very feathers of the birds that came flying from it. Hardly a word was spoken on board all that day till about dinner time. No one wanted any dinner, and water was enough for them. Turian said, I can't understand this. There is not a breath of wind. The sail hangs dead. This sea is as flat as a pond, and yet we drive on as fast as if there was a gale behind us. I've been thinking that too, said Caspian. We must have caught some strong current. Said Edmund. That's not so nice if the world really has an edge and we're getting near to it. You mean, said Caspian, that we might be just, well, poured over it? Well, yes, said Reepicheep, clapping his paws together. That's what I've always imagined it, the world like a great round table and the waters of the ocean endlessly pouring over the edge. The ship will rip up, stand on her head for one moment, and we shall be wet all over. And we shall see over the edge, and then down, down, down in such a rush, the speed. And what do you think will be waiting for us at the bottom, said Durian. Aslan's country, perhaps, said the mouse, in its eyes shining. Or perhaps there isn't any bottom. Perhaps it goes down forever and ever. But whatever it is, it won't be worth anything just to have looked for one moment beyond the edge of the world. So in the Bible, it does talk about a pit that is bottomless. Maybe you can figure out what pit that is. But look here, said Eustace. This is not. The world's round, I mean. Round like a ball, not like a table. Our world is, said Edmund. But is this? Do you mean to say, asked Caspian, that you three come from a round world, round like a ball, and you've never told me? It's really too bad of you, because we have fairy tales in which there are round worlds, and I always loved them. I never believed there were any real ones, but I've always wished there were, and I've always longed to live in one. Oh, I'd give anything. I wonder why you can get into our world and we never get into yours. If only I had the chance. It must be so exciting to live on a thing like a ball. Have you ever been to the parts where the people walk about upside down? Edmund shook his head. And it isn't like that, he added. There's nothing particularly exciting about a round world when you're there. And that's the end of chapter 15.